The wind was a constant companion on the Arizona plains, brushing across the tall grass and rattling the dry mesquite branches with the sound of whispered memories. Thomas Grady had long since learned to live with the silence of these parts. Out here, silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of everything left unsaid, the ghosts of moments that never got to finish becoming memories. Every morning he rose before the sun, his body responding to years of habit rather than desire. The house creaked around him, a structure too large for one man, but he moved through it like a shadow, never quite touching the spaces that had once been alive with laughter and warmth. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and pine dust. The calendar on the wall still hung open to the same month from years ago, July, because no one was around to turn the page anymore. Thomas dressed in silence, slipping on a worn flannel shirt, jeans that were more patch than original fabric, and boots scuffed from years of kicking through dust and disappointment. Outside, the morning air was cool but hinted at the heat to come. Bo, his old cattle dog, stood and stretched beside the porch steps, his joints creaking in sympathy with Thomas's own. "Come on, boy," Thomas muttered, adjusting the brim of his hat. "Fence won't check itself." They rode out together, Thomas on his quarter horse Dusty, Bo trotting a few paces ahead, sniffing the trail like it still held secrets worth knowing. The fence on the north side had been giving him trouble lately, coyotes, or maybe just time chewing away at the posts. He wasn't sure why he bothered anymore. No one came out this far except the wind, and the cows were too old to wander far. Still, he rode the line. He needed the motion, the rhythm. Something about riding kept the grief from swallowing him whole. Years ago, this same trail had echoed with 2 sets of hoofbeats. His wife Clara had loved to ride with him. She'd fill the silence with stories, dreams, plans for children and painted barns. She had a laugh that could cut through sorrow like sunlight through clouds. But all of that had died in a bloody mess one cruel spring. A birthing gone wrong, a baby that never cried, and a silence that had lingered ever since. Thomas hadn't been the same. He stayed because he didn't know where else to go. The ranch was the last thing that felt like hers. It was near midday when the canyon edge came into view. It was a place he seldom visited unless something needed fixing. The land dipped sharply there, a shallow gorge that carved its way like a scar through the otherwise flat expanse. As he neared, Bo began barking, not the excited kind, but low and sharp, the kind that meant something wasn't right. "Easy, Bo," Thomas said, pulling the reins and narrowing his eyes. From the saddle he could make out movement down by the rocks. At first, it looked like some kind of animal, a deer maybe, or a coyote nosing around a carcass. But as he dismounted and approached the edge, he saw her, a girl. She couldn't have been more than 12 or 13, crouched beside a paint mustang that lay motionless on its side. Her small hands gripped the horse's mane, her dark hair tangled and dirty. She was crying, but not loudly. The sound was raw and broken, like someone trying not to break apart but failing. Thomas felt something in his chest twist. He scanned the area. No sign of a camp, no tracks leading in from the north. Whoever she was, she hadn't come by road. He looked at the horse again. Its flanks rose and fell in shallow breaths, its sides slick with sweat and blood. The angle of its leg told him what he needed to know. It had fallen hard, probably snapped something trying to climb out of the canyon. "Hey," he said softly, taking a careful step closer. The girl flinched, curling tighter into herself, one arm wrapped protectively around the horse's neck. "I'm not gonna hurt you," Thomas said. "Name's Thomas Grady. I've got water. You need help." She didn't speak. Her eyes, wide and rimmed with dust, watched him like a cornered animal. Her clothes were torn, more dirt than fabric. There was blood on her arm, crusted and dry, and one of her feet was bare and swollen. Bo whined beside him, sensing the tension. Thomas knelt slowly, taking off his canteen and setting it on the ground between them. "You can have it. Ain't poisoned." Still no response. But her gaze flicked to the canteen. Her lips were cracked. He waited. After a minute, she inched forward, grabbed the canteen, and scrambled back just as quickly. She drank like someone who hadn't had water in days, gulping, choking, eyes darting up at him between swallows. Thomas let her finish. Then he stood and looked at the horse again. "Poor bastard's in pain," he muttered. The girl stiffened. She reached for the horse's head, murmuring something in a language Thomas didn't understand. He knelt again, closer this time. The horse's eyes rolled white. It tried to lift its head but failed. "She your horse?" he asked. No answer. "I don't reckon it'll last long," he added gently. "It's suffering." The girl turned sharply to him, her eyes fierce with a kind of desperation that made his throat go tight. She shook her head violently, her fingers gripping the horse's mane again. Thomas sighed. "I know you don't want to hear this." But he's not getting up. He reached to his belt, pulled out his revolver, and checked the cylinder. The click of the metal made the girl recoil, and for a moment Thomas thought she might run. But she didn't. Instead, she turned and pressed her forehead to the horse's neck. Her shoulders shook. Thomas waited until her hand lifted just a little, and she nodded once without looking at him. He stood. The sound was mercifully quick. The echo rolled up the canyon walls and disappeared into the wind. The girl didn't move for a long time after that. Thomas sat near her, saying nothing. Bo rested his head on his paws and kept one eye open. Eventually, the girl stirred. She wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, leaving a smear of dirt across her cheek. Her eyes, red and hollow, met his again. "You got a name?" Thomas asked. She stared at him, then whispered something so softly he almost missed it. "Lena." He nodded. "You hurt?" She hesitated, then held out her arm. The gash along her forearm looked angry and infected. She didn't flinch when he examined it, just watched him with the wary resignation of someone who had learned early that pain was a part of life. "Gonna need to clean that," he said. "Ain't got much out here, but I got some salve back at the ranch." Her expression didn't change, but she didn't pull away when he stood and offered his hand. "You can ride with me. I'll make sure you're safe." Lena looked at the dead horse one last time, whispered something in Apache, then allowed him to lift her up. He placed her in the saddle first, then swung up behind her. She was light, too light. Thomas could feel the thinness of her frame through the torn shirt she wore. He adjusted his coat to cover her shoulders. They rode in silence, the sun beginning its slow descent behind the canyon wall. Lena said nothing, but she didn't resist when he wrapped an arm around her to steady her. Bo ran ahead, glancing back now and then like he was checking to make sure they were still there. Back at the ranch, Thomas helped her down and guided her inside. The house felt suddenly full, the air somehow less still. He poured her some stew from the pot on the stove, not expecting her to eat much, but she surprised him. Hunger, it seemed, could break through even the deepest fear. After she ate, he cleaned her wound. She winced but didn't cry. Her eyes never left his hands. He laid out a bedroll in the corner of the room and gave her a clean shirt to sleep in. She took it wordlessly and curled up with a blanket. Thomas sat in his old armchair long after she drifted off. The lantern's flame flickered quietly in the silence. Outside, the wind moved through the grass like a lullaby. Something had changed. And though he didn't yet know what lay ahead, Thomas Grady knew one thing. The silence was finally broken. The morning after brought with it a stillness that felt different than the silence Thomas was used to. This wasn't the vast, lonely quiet of the land or the weight of memory that clung to the air. It was a living stillness, heavy with breath and heartbeats, shaped by the presence of another soul beneath his roof. He hadn't realized how long it had been since someone else had shared his space. Even Bo seemed to tread more carefully, his nails clicking more softly across the floorboards as he padded past Lena's makeshift bed in the corner. Thomas sipped his coffee, lukewarm now, staring out the window at the morning light beginning to gild the tops of the dry grass. The stove crackled behind him, giving off the only sound besides Bo's breathing. He hadn't slept much, kept turning things over in his mind. Where had the girl come from? Why was she alone? And what the hell had happened to drive her to that canyon with a dying horse and no shoes? He didn't have the answers. Not yet. Behind him, the blankets rustled. Thomas turned just enough to catch Lena sitting up, her hair a mess of tangled strands, her eyes still swollen from the night before. She looked around the room cautiously, then down at her arm, which was now wrapped neatly in linen. "You're safe," Thomas said without looking at her directly. "That wound's clean now. You'll want to keep it that way." Lena didn't speak. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and sat perfectly still, her small frame rigid as a deer caught in the scent of a predator. Thomas sighed, stood, and poured a tin cup of water, setting it down on the table near her. Then he pulled a chair out and sat at the opposite end, placing his coffee down with a soft clink. "I got eggs. Might be cold now, but it's food," he offered. She blinked slowly, and after a moment, slid off the bedroll and walked barefoot to the table. She sat, but didn't touch the water. She just looked at it. At him. At the walls around her. Thomas stirred his coffee. "I ain't gonna ask you 100 questions. You talk when you're ready. Deal?" Her eyes flicked to his. She nodded once, barely more than a twitch. He gave her a small nod back. That was something. The morning passed in halting rhythms. Thomas took her outside with him to feed the chickens, fix the back latch on the barn, and check the water troughs. She didn't speak, but she followed, watched. She didn't flinch when Bo brushed up against her leg, nor when the rooster snapped its beak too close to her ankle. She was steady in a way that didn't seem like fearlessness. It seemed like she'd already seen the worst and decided nothing else could surprise her. Later, as he hammered in a new board on the barn wall, Thomas glanced back and saw her sitting on the porch, knees pulled to her chest, watching the horizon like she was expecting it to shift and open up. By the third day, she spoke. Not much, just a few words. "Where's your family?" she asked quietly, as Thomas sharpened a sickle near the barn. He paused, wiped the blade clean with a rag, then looked up at her. She was sitting on the fence, legs dangling, her injured arm held carefully against her stomach. "Gone," he said. "Long time now?" She nodded slowly, like she understood. Maybe she did. "You?" She didn't answer, just looked away and slid off the fence. That was answer enough. That night, as the oil lamp flickered against the walls, she stood beside the small desk by the window and picked up the charcoal pencil lying there. Without asking, she dragged a piece of scrap paper toward her and began to draw. Thomas sat in his armchair, watching quietly. She didn't notice at first, or pretended not to. Her hand moved with surprising confidence, sketching out the contours of a horse, slender legs, flared nostrils, a wild mane caught in the wind. It looked just like the one in the canyon, the one he'd put down. When she was finished, she turned the paper around and held it up. He was called Taka. Thomas studied the drawing. Then her eyes. There was pain in them, but also something more solid now. A name gave the horse meaning. Grief. Honor. "That's a good name," he said. The days began to shift after that. Lena didn't smile, but she moved with a little more ease. She began to speak in full sentences, sometimes in broken English, other times in Apache that Thomas couldn't understand. But the tone said enough. She was no longer hiding. Thomas found himself talking more, too. He told her about the land, about the way cattle needed tending, even when you didn't feel like moving, about Clara's jam recipe that he could never quite get right. Lena listened. Sometimes she asked questions. Other times, she just watched. But not everything was so quiet. One afternoon, Thomas decided to take her into town. He needed supplies. Salve, rice, bullets. He didn't feel comfortable leaving her alone, not after what she'd already been through. He told her so. She didn't argue. The ride to town was long and dry, the heat crawling over them like a living thing. Lena rode behind him on Dusty, arms wrapped loosely around his waist. Bo trailed behind, tongue-lolling. The town wasn't big, just a string of buildings along a main road, all with the same sun-bleached signs and cracked paint. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and the sheriff's office. The moment they entered town, Thomas felt the eyes. A few men sitting outside the saloon straightened up. Two women standing near the well stopped talking. One of them whispered behind her hand. Thomas dismounted, helped Lena down, and kept his hand near his belt. Not on the gun, just close enough to remind people. Inside the store, he grabbed what he needed quickly. The shopkeeper, old Mr. Farnham, raised a brow when he saw Lena, but said nothing. Just rang them up with a thin frown. Outside, they almost made it back to the horse when the sheriff stepped out of his office. "Grady," Sheriff Donnelly called. Thomas turned slowly. "Sheriff." Donnelly was a tall man with sharp shoulders and a mustache like a curled dagger. His eyes flicked to Lena, then back to Thomas. "You got a new ranch hand?" "Just a guest. Didn't know you were running a boarding house. Wasn't aware I needed your permission to help a kid in trouble." Donnelly took a step closer. His boots scraped on the dry ground. The sun carved deep lines into his face, made his eyes seem darker. "Lot of folks around here wouldn't take kindly to that sort of guest," he said. "Girl like her? Brings trouble. You know that." Thomas felt Lena move closer behind him. He didn't turn. "She's not bringing trouble," Thomas said evenly. "She's had enough of it." The sheriff didn't say anything for a moment. Then he smiled. A slow, unfriendly thing. "Don't say I didn't warn you." He turned and walked back inside, spitting once in the dust before slamming the door. They rode back in silence. Thomas's jaw was clenched so tight it hurt. Lena didn't speak, but he could feel her trembling against his back. That night, after dinner, Lena sat beside the window again. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "They hate me." Thomas didn't pretend to misunderstand. "They don't know you," he said. "They don't want to." He looked at her, saw the way her fingers were clenched in her lap. "You're not what they say. You hear me?" She nodded slowly, then asked, "Will you send me away?" Thomas blinked. "No. But it's dangerous now. For you. I don't care." She looked at him, and for the first time her face softened. Not quite a smile, but close. "You're not like the others. I'm just a tired old man who knows right from wrong." Outside, the wind picked up again, rustling the grass like distant applause. Inside, Lena slept a little deeper that night. And for the first time since finding her, Thomas dreamed of something other than Clara's voice, fading into the wind. He dreamed of a girl on a horse, riding fast across the plain, laughing as the sky turned gold. Thomas had lived long enough to recognize when something in the air was shifting. The signs weren't always loud, no crashing thunder or angry skies, but he could feel it in the way the wind carried whispers instead of peace, in how even the birds seemed hesitant to fill the morning with song. The town hadn't needed much of a reason to judge, and Lena's presence was more than enough to stoke a fire that had long been simmering beneath the surface. The days after their visit to town passed with a slower rhythm. Thomas found himself watching the trail that led to the front gate more often than usual. Eyes narrowed under the brim of his hat. He checked his rifle each night before bed and bolted the doors, something he hadn't done in years. Lena noticed, of course, but said nothing. She was observant that way, always watching, always holding her questions, until she knew it was safe to ask them. She had started drawing more, pages filled with mustangs, deer, birds, and mountains. Sometimes she would sketch Thomas, though never when he was looking. Once, he caught a glimpse of one picture half tucked under her mattress. It showed a man with a crooked nose and sad eyes, standing under a tree beside a dog with a limp tail. There was no doubt who it was meant to be. She didn't hide it from him. She only looked away when he saw it. One morning, Thomas rode out to the edge of the canyon where he'd first found her. He hadn't been back since that day, but something urged him now. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe guilt. Bo followed behind, older now, his pace slower but still loyal. The canyon looked much the same, steep edges, scattered rocks, wind brushing through the mesquite. But the place where the horse had fallen was no longer just a spot on the land. It had weight now. He climbed down carefully, boots scraping loose gravel, and stood where Lena had once sat. The dirt was disturbed, a shallow mound of rocks marking where he'd buried the Mustang. He knelt, touching the earth without speaking. He didn't know what prayer she had whispered that day, but he found himself hoping it had found its way, wherever it was meant to go. Back at the ranch, Lena was outside brushing one of the older mares, her small hand moving with practiced care. She'd begun spending more time with the horses, and they seemed to trust her as easily as Bo had. She hummed sometimes while she worked, not a song Thomas recognized, but it carried a strange comfort. The ranch had begun to feel different, as if the land itself was slowly waking up after a long winter. But not everything that stirred was good. It was just after sundown when the knock came. Thomas froze mid-step, the fire from the stove casting flickers on the wooden floor. Bo let out a low growl and moved to the door. "Stay back," Thomas said to Lena, setting his mug down and grabbing the rifle from its place near the window. The knock came again, 2 short raps, then silence. He opened the door slowly. Standing on the porch was Caleb Jennings, the young deputy from town. His hat was in his hands, his face pale in the lantern light. "Evenin', Mr. Grady," he said. Thomas didn't lower the rifle. "You alone?" "Yes, sir." "Then, speak." Caleb looked over his shoulder once, then back. "I shouldn't be here, but I thought you should know. Sheriff Donnelly, he's got his eye on you. Said you're harboring a fugitive." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "She's a child." Caleb nodded. "I know. I don't agree with him, sir, but he's got friends in the ranch council. Big names. They're saying she's Apache, that she was part of a raid a while back." Thomas stepped forward. "That's a lie. I figured it might be, but there's talk. Some folks think you're stirring up sympathy for her kind." Thomas lowered the rifle, but only slightly. "You think they'll come out here?" Caleb hesitated. "If I know Donnelly, he won't wait for the law to catch up. He'll try and scare you first, then worse." Thomas exhaled through his nose. "Why are you telling me?" Caleb looked away, ashamed. "Because my pa was like you once. Took in people when it was dangerous. Said a man's soul rots if he only watches wrong happen." Thomas stepped aside. "You want coffee?" Caleb blinked. "Sir?" "Coffee. I made too much." Inside, Lena watched them both with wide eyes as Thomas poured a cup and handed it to Caleb. "I'll see to the fence tomorrow," Thomas said. "Thanks for the warning." Caleb nodded. "Be careful. He's got folks watching your land. Could be he's already planned something." When the deputy left, Thomas bolted the door again and looked at Lena. "I'm not sending you away," he said, "but you need to know this ain't gonna be easy." Lena nodded. "I know." He rubbed the back of his neck. "You ever use a rifle?" She paused. "A little. My uncle taught me to hunt. You'll need to show me tomorrow." The next few days passed with a tension that clung to everything. They fixed the fence together. He taught her how to load and clean the rifle properly. She was quiet, but steady-handed. The girl had no fear when it came to weapons, only caution. One morning, while checking the perimeter, they found a rabbit hanging from the fence post. Its throat had been slit, its body strung up like a warning. Thomas cursed under his breath and took it down. Lena said nothing, but her lips pressed into a tight line. That night, he sat by the window with the rifle across his lap, watching the shadows stretch across the land. Bo lay at his feet, ears twitching. "Why do they hate us?" Lena asked softly from the corner. Thomas didn't answer right away. "Some folks live in fear their whole lives," he finally said. "Fear of what they don't understand. Fear of losing what they think is theirs. That kind of fear twists a man. But I didn't do anything to them." "You don't have to." She looked away, her small hands clenched. "There's more," she said. "About what happened." Thomas turned to her fully. "I'm listening." She took a long breath. "They came one night. Men on horses. They said our people stole cattle. But we didn't. My mother tried to talk to them. She spoke English. They didn't listen. They shot her." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. "I ran," Lena whispered. "Taka found me in the woods. He was my mother's horse. He let me ride. We didn't stop." Thomas swallowed the knot rising in his throat. "You did the right thing. Running saved your life. I don't want to run anymore. You won't, not while I'm breathing." That promise was tested sooner than he expected. It was a cloudless night. The stars spread wide above like scattered silver. Thomas had dozed in his chair, the rifle leaning against the window frame. Lena was asleep near the fire. Then Bo growled. Thomas woke instantly, hand snapping to the rifle. He moved to the door and peered through the crack. 2 riders. No lanterns. No torches. Just silhouettes in the dark. He moved quickly, silently waking Lena. She blinked the sleep away, eyes immediately alert. "Quiet," he whispered. "Get to the cellar." She obeyed, without question. The knock came again. Slow, deliberate. Thomas opened the door halfway, rifle raised. "Evening, Grady," a voice drawled. It was Rick Mallory, one of Donnelly's men, a rancher with more land than morals. "You're trespassing," Thomas said. "We heard you got company," Mallory said. "Heard she's real good at sneaking around places she don't belong." "She's a child, Rick. She's an Indian. That's what matters." Thomas stepped fully into the doorway. "You got 10 seconds to get off my land," Mallory chuckled. "You always were a stubborn bastard." 8. The second rider shifted in his saddle. "You're gonna regret this," Mallory hissed. Thomas didn't answer. He raised the rifle slightly. They rode off, hooves kicking up dust. He watched until they vanished into the dark. Then he bolted the door again and turned to Lena as she emerged from the trapdoor near the fireplace. "Are we safe?" she asked. "Not yet," Thomas said, "but we're ready now." And he meant it. The fire came just after midnight, tearing through the barn like it had been waiting for years to feast on dry wood and forgotten memories. Thomas had always feared the sound of gunshots, the eerie silence of an open door that should have been shut, the distant hooves of unwelcome riders. But nothing had prepared him for the sound of fire, devouring the structure that had stood longer than he had owned the land. He woke to Bo's frantic barking. The heat was already licking at the walls of the house, the air thick with smoke and panic. Thomas was on his feet before he knew what was happening, grabbing his rifle and yelling for Lena. She was already standing in the center of the room, eyes wide with terror, her small hand clutching the edge of the table for balance. She didn't scream, didn't ask questions, just looked to Thomas for direction. "Get outside!" he shouted over the roar of flames and the dog's growls. "Now!" The door burst open as he grabbed Lena's arm and pulled her through. The night was bright as day, the barn nothing more than a glowing skeleton of timber and fury. Sparks rained down on the yard, and the horses in the small pen nearby kicked and whinnied in panic, their screams almost human. "Help me with the gate!" Thomas barked. Together they unlatched the fencing, flinging the gate wide so the horses could escape. One stumbled past, singed but alive. Lena, coughing from the smoke, turned her eyes back toward the barn. "Bo!" she cried, voice hoarse. Thomas turned in time to see the dog dart inside. "No! Bo!" he shouted, racing after him. But the heat surged forward in a wave, forcing him back. He staggered, shielding his face, watching helplessly as the flames swallowed the doorway. Bo didn't come back out. The weight of that sank in all at once, driving Thomas to his knees. The dog had been more than a companion. Bo had been his last thread to the years before loss hardened his soul into stone. And now he was gone too. He clenched his jaw so hard it ached, then stood and turned to Lena, who stood frozen, her face streaked with ash and tears. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry, girl." She said nothing, just walked forward and wrapped her arms around him. The fire raged on into the early hours. By the time it died down, only smoldering beams and glowing embers remained where the barn had once stood. The smell of smoke clung to everything. The house, their skin, the sky itself. Lena didn't let go of Thomas the rest of the night. She didn't need to speak. Her silence screamed everything they'd both lost. When morning came, Thomas poured water over the last glowing piles, the hiss of steam rising like the barn's final breath. His hands were blackened, blistered in places, but he didn't stop working. He couldn't afford to, not now. He knew who'd done this. There was no question. And this time, there would be no more warnings. While Lena rested inside, Thomas saddled Dusty and rode hard into town, the rifle strapped to his back, his face like thunder carved into flesh. The townsfolk stepped out of his way as he passed, recognizing the expression of a man who had already lost too much. He dismounted in front of the sheriff's office and kicked open the door. Sheriff Donnelly looked up from behind his desk, lips curled into something between annoyance and amusement. "Grady," he drawled, "heard there was some trouble on your property." Thomas didn't answer right away. He walked to the center of the room and dropped a half-burned piece of his barn wall onto the desk. A blackened horseshoe, still warm, rolled to a stop against a stack of papers. Donnelly stared at it. "I want names," Thomas said. The sheriff leaned back in his chair. "You accusing someone, Grady?" "I'm accusing you of knowing damn well who did it, and letting them." Donnelly's eyes narrowed. "You come in here, tossing threats around like you got the law behind you. Maybe you forgot, but it's my job to keep the peace." "Peace?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "You call torching a man's barn peace? You brought this on yourself, taking in that girl, stirring up talk. Some folks see that as trouble. She's a child. Her mother was murdered. And you're hiding the men who did it." Donnelly stood, slow and deliberate. "Watch your mouth, Grady." Thomas stepped forward until only the desk separated them. "No more warnings, Donnelly. Next time, I'm not coming to talk." The sheriff didn't flinch. "You threatening an officer of the law? I'm reminding you that even out here, justice still means something." He turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. The town was quiet as he passed. He didn't look anyone in the eye, not even the shopkeeper, who had once offered him a free sack of flour after Clara died. Back at the ranch, Lena was waiting on the porch, wrapped in one of Clara's old shawls. She stood when she saw him, but said nothing. "They won't stop," Thomas said as he approached. "Not unless we make them." Her voice was soft, but steady. "How?" He looked out at the land stretching beyond the ridge. "We bring the truth to light." Over the next 3 days, Thomas worked with a fury that would have broken a younger man. He gathered maps, letters, deeds, anything that proved what he suspected. The land Donnelly and his rancher friends had acquired over the last 5 years all bordered reservation territory. Too convenient. Too precise. Lena helped him sort through papers, her sharp mind picking up patterns even he missed. She remembered the men who had come to her village. Their badges. Their horses. One had a scar across his nose. Another wore a silver ring with a red stone. She drew them both, and Thomas recognized them. The pieces were coming together. It was time. He rode into town with Lena at his side. She wore a clean dress and Clara's old boots, too big but sturdy. Her hair was braided neatly, her expression calm. She didn't speak much, but she didn't have to. Her presence was its own kind of truth. The townspeople gathered as they rode past, curious, nervous. The whispers followed them like shadows. When they reached the center of town, Thomas dismounted and climbed the steps to the courthouse building, used mostly for town meetings and dusty records. It wasn't much, but it had a podium and space for witnesses. Sheriff Donnelly stood near the steps, arms crossed. "What do you think you're doing?" Thomas didn't stop. "Telling the truth. You're welcome to listen." Inside, he set the maps and drawings on the table and turned to the small crowd that had followed. "This town has a sickness," he began, voice rough but firm. "For years now, land's been changing hands through threats, fire, and blood. People like Lena's family, peaceful, honest, have been driven out, murdered, blamed. Because men like Donnelly let it happen." Murmurs stirred. "He says it's about the law," Thomas continued. "But law without justice is just control. And I won't stand for it anymore." He laid out the maps, the drawings, the list of names Lena had remembered. Deputy Caleb stepped forward from the back of the crowd. He looked pale, but determined. "I've seen the same," he said. "I kept quiet. I shouldn't have." More murmurs. Sheriff Donnelly stepped forward, red-faced. "You've got no proof." "I've got survivors," Thomas said, gesturing to Lena. She saw who killed her mother, drew their faces. And I've got a ledger from one of your men's bunkhouses with payments tied to your name. Gasps. I don't need a jury, Thomas added. I just need people to open their damn eyes. Silence fell. A long, breathless silence. Then someone clapped. One man, then another, and then more. Donnelly looked around, eyes wild. You're all fools, he hissed. You'll regret this. No, Thomas said quietly. You will. Later that day, a wire was sent to the territorial marshals. Donnelly was arrested. His allies scattered like rats. And for the first time in years, the town breathed something close to relief. That night, Lena stood beside the ruined barn, looking up at the stars. They'll come back someday, she said. Maybe, Thomas said, joining her, but they'll find we're ready. He looked down at her, this girl who had once been silent as the stones, and saw in her something brighter than fire. Hope. The ash from the burned barn still lingered in the dirt, even after the rains came and tried to wash it away. It clung to the soil like a memory that refused to be forgotten. Thomas didn't rebuild the barn right away. He left the charred frame standing like a monument to everything that had happened, not as a symbol of defeat, but of survival. The town was different now, quieter, cautious. Sheriff Donnelly was gone, taken by the marshals in a quiet procession that felt more like an exorcism than a lawman's removal. No one had thrown stones or cursed him on the way out. That wasn't how this town worked. They didn't yell when they hated you. They watched. They whispered. They waited to see who would fill the space you left behind. It was Caleb Jennings who stepped up. The young deputy didn't wear his badge with swagger or pride. He wore it like a burden, knowing every decision he made would be measured against the silence of those who came before him. He came by the ranch 2 days after Donnelly's arrest with a paper in hand and an awkward smile. It's official, he said, handing the letter to Thomas. The council wants you to sign off as a character witness, said it would help put the trials in motion. Thomas read the words slowly, then looked up. I'm not much for courts. Caleb nodded. I told them that, but they're listening now. I think they'd listen to you. Lena watched from the doorway, her eyes sharp. She hadn't said much since the day in the courthouse. It was as if the fight had taken more from her than she expected. She still drew, still walked the land like it belonged to her bones, but the light inside her had dimmed. Not gone, just waiting. Thomas didn't want to leave her alone again. Not after everything. But he also knew the wheels of justice didn't turn on their own. Someone had to give them a push. He agreed to ride in the next morning. When he returned 3 days later, Lena met him halfway down the road. She'd saddled Dusty and was already mounted, wearing one of Clara's old scarves tied around her braid. She handed Thomas the reins to his own horse without saying a word. He swung up beside her. Where are we headed? She didn't look at him, just pointed toward the hills. Up. They rode for hours, the wind at their backs and the sky a wide, endless blue. The path was one Thomas hadn't taken in years. It wound through the high country where the trees grew close and the earth was red with clay. Eventually, they reached a clearing where the land opened like a sigh. Lena dismounted and walked to a large, flat stone near the edge of a cliff. From there, you could see everything. The town, the ranch, even the broken line of the canyon far to the south. This is where she brought me, Lena said quietly. Thomas didn't need to ask who she meant. She used to sing up here, she continued. Said the sky could hear us better. He sat beside her on the rock. The wind tugged at his sleeves, but he didn't move. She'd be proud of you, he said. Lena looked down. I'm still angry. Good, Thomas said. Anger means you still care. I hate them, she whispered. He didn't correct her, didn't try to soften it. I used to hate too, he said after a long pause. After Clara and the baby, I hated everything. God, the land, myself. But hate doesn't go away just because you want it to. You have to give it somewhere to go. She looked at him. Where did you put yours? He was quiet for a long time. I buried it with her, he said. Then I forgot who I was. She didn't speak after that, just sat with him as the sun dipped lower, turning the sky the color of old embers. When they returned to the ranch, Lena went straight to the work shed. Thomas heard her rummaging through the shelves, pulling out nails, wood, paint. She worked through the evening, hammering quietly, focused like she was building something she could stand on. In the morning, she showed him what she'd made. A sign, carved with careful hands, the letters uneven but proud. It read, Grady Ranch, home to all. Thomas didn't say anything, just helped her mount it by the front gate. Word spread quickly. People who had once turned their backs began to stop by, some offering help, others simply nodding as they passed. An older couple from the far side of town brought over 2 piglets. A widow donated a wagon full of seed. And one afternoon, a group of Apache elders arrived. They didn't speak much at first, just stood near the barn ruins, murmuring prayers Thomas didn't understand. Lena greeted them in her native tongue, her voice stronger than it had been in days. One of the elders, a woman with silver hair braided down her back, took Thomas's hand and held it tightly. "You kept her safe," she said. "You carry her father's strength now." He didn't know what to say, just nodded and looked away so she wouldn't see his eyes burn. The elders stayed for 2 days, helping to rebuild the barn. They brought tools, hands, and stories. At night they lit a fire and sang songs that floated across the fields like smoke. Lena sat beside them, her shoulders relaxed, her eyes alight. Thomas stood in the shadows, watching. He didn't belong in those stories. But he was part of them now, even if only as the man who gave one girl a chance to stay alive long enough to return to her own people. One evening, Caleb rode out to the ranch with a sealed envelope. He handed it to Thomas without a word. Inside was a court declaration, signed by a judge and 2 witnesses. The adoption had been finalized. Lena was officially his daughter now. She didn't cry when he told her. She didn't say anything, just hugged him tighter than she ever had before. The ranch changed after that. It became more than a home. It became a place where others came to find healing. A traveling preacher set up a Sunday tent. A runaway boy from the mining town was taken in. Even Caleb began visiting more often, not as a lawman, but as a friend. Lena started teaching the younger kids how to draw. She painted a mural on the barn wall, a picture of horses running across open land, their hooves full of fire and freedom. Sometimes, Thomas caught her singing. She said it was for her mother, but Thomas knew it was also for herself. One night, as they sat by the fire, Lena leaned against him and said, "Do you think Bo's still out there somewhere?" Thomas looked up at the stars. If there's any justice in the world, he's chasing rabbits in heaven and rolling in the grass. She smiled. The stars above blinked slowly as if agreeing. Life didn't go back to what it was before. It became something new. Not easier, not without pain, but honest, full. And when Thomas rode the fence line now, he didn't do it alone. Beside him rode a girl with fire in her heart and her mother's courage in her veins. A daughter not by blood, but by choice. And in the wind, he could almost hear Clara's voice whispering, "You found your way home." In a land where silence once reigned and hatred threatened to divide, it was love, courage, and compassion that stitched 2 broken lives back together. Thomas, Grady, and Lena reminded us that family isn't always born. It's built. And sometimes, the strongest bonds are forged in fire, loss, and the quiet decision to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. If stories of redemption, found family, and the untamed beauty of the old frontier stirs something in your heart, then don't miss a single tale. Subscribe now to Wild West Love Chronicles and ride with us through more unforgettable journeys where grit meets grace and love always finds a way, even in the wildest of places. Hit that bell so you're never left behind on the trail.